Hello, my name is Nicholas Olivas. I'm a history student at the University of California, Davis. This is my final project for History of Modern Iran. I did a podcast with three intellectuals and myself. Farhan Mansourian, he's a business professor from Iran. Professor Sabrina Jimenez, she's a history professor at Crafton Hills College. And Tim Sumner is a student at Crafton Hills College. These are their narratives on the history of Iran and how those events made Iran what it is today. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy it. Okay, let's go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, and we're live. Just make sure that you speak into the microphone because that's very important. Okay. All right, first question. When you hear Iran, what immediately goes through your head? And anybody can answer at any time. Doesn't matter.
Well, since I'm from Iran, the first thing that goes through my mind is that such a beautiful country it is. I was there a few months ago, as a matter of fact, after many years that I hadn't been there. And despite what you hear in terms of more or less negative propaganda against, it's mostly against the regime, but it will be translated or interpreted against Iran and Iranian people. It's a very friendly country, beautiful sceneries, nice, hospitable people. I guess the best example would be Anthony Bourdain program that he did about Iran. That would give a better impression to people than what they hear in the news about Iran.
I agree, and for me, I was raised in a neighborhood with a lot of people from Iran, whether they were Christian or Islamic. It was a very diverse area in LA. And so I automatically think of the culture, the parties, the food, and also just the way they would tell me stories about their past life in Iran before the revolution in particular. For example, some of the stereotypes is revolving around the geography, that it's desert. But they have great ski resorts in Iran. And so there's a lot of stereotypes in the West.
Yes.
For me, it's mostly, when you say Iran, I think of family and friends that
More into the mic.
I think of family and friends that I've come across that are Iranian. So it just evokes good feelings because they're always very happy and outgoing, and it's a nice community.
And when I think of Iran, the only thing I think of are two things. I think of the 79 revolution and Ayatollah Khomeini, and I think of the movie Argo. And those are my biggest impressions of Iran. Other than that, I really try not to pay attention to mainstream media, and I just go from there, basically. Now, one thing I really want to know is what's the difference between Shia and Sunni Muslims? From my understanding, Iran is mostly Shia Muslim, right?
That's right.
Oh. And why is Iran Shia Muslim? Sabrina?
I can answer that. Do you want to go?
No, go for it, and I'll build on that.
Okay.
Sure, go ahead.
Well, the basic difference between Sunni and Shia Islam is really the difference between the argument, or the difference between them regarding who was supposed to succeed Prophet Muhammad. Sunnis believe that whoever was the most qualified person should have replaced or succeed him.
Elected. He needed to be elected. And I started with Abu Bakr.
Very good. And Shias believe that it should be somebody in the same bloodline as Muhammad.
Through the female bloodline.
Through the female.
The daughter of Muhammad.
Now, does that mean that Islam is more matriarchal? Or
You
no?
mean Shia is more
Or
matriarchal.
Shia is it more?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
No.
Okay. Just want to clarify that for the listeners.
Unfortunately, most religions are patriarchal.
Are patriarchal,
Yes,
of course.
Christianity, Judaism, and Islam included.
Yeah.
Apart from indigenous
Apart from-
traditions,
the-
Native American traditions of North America, they are
Unfortunately, the major
matriarchal.
religions
Right.
mostly are patriarchal.
The split
Absolutely.
continues to this day because a lot of the territorial issues and
Mhm.
rivalries are based on the difference between Sunni and Shia
Yeah.
currently.
And there's also actually, you know, in when we speak of terrorism, there's actually two sects of there's like isn't there like Sunni terrorism and Shia terrorism?
Yes, absolutely, there is, and they have different styles, especially in non-combat zones, and that's important to note. So, Sunni terrorism in non-combat zones, usually they resort to terroristic activities that revolve around explosions, random attacks, guerrilla warfare. Shia terrorism, on the other hand, based upon the research, is more political, and their aims are usually clandestine, and they infiltrate societies and also their culture, and they infiltrate governments, and they often, rather than getting involved in bombings, for example, they will kidnap in order to achieve political gains, depending upon whatever agenda they have.
So would you say that Sunni terrorism is more? Are they more? Do they believe more in martyrdom than Shia?
The evidence since the 1980s definitely reflects that. Okay, so absolutely, jihad in the current environment, definitely in the Sunni culture, revolves around martyrdom.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, especially amongst the Wahhabi cultures coming out of Saudi Arabia, but you can find Wahhabism in Iran as well, and throughout the Mediterranean. However, Shia terrorism based in organizations like Hezbollah, for example, which has connections with Iran, they definitely have more political aims in their terrorist activities, and so they will commit crimes in order to achieve some sort of end to their political aim.
Definitely. You know, I know that we weren't really going to get into the constitutional revolution of Iran, but I really think it's important to even mention it. You know, before Iran's constitutional revolution in 1905, there were factors that contributed to this revolution. I'd like to discuss these factors because you see them in every revolution that takes place, whether it be, you know, the American Revolution or the French Revolution, Russian Revolution, the Red Revolution. So, I mean, all the factors that take place in any revolution come down to people aren't happy and, you know, economically, you got a corrupt government. Like in Iran's case, Nasruddin Shah was selling concessions to European powers to develop the country rather than, you know, of course they were a weakened state, but how did that affect the Iranian citizens when they see their government so weak?
The Qajar dynasty, Nasruddin Shah was one of them, was a very weak and corrupt dynasty. So they were selling concessions to European, not just to develop Iran, but to get money and spend it on extravagant vacations and palaces. In one instance, I forgot which one, maybe it was Ahmad Shah that borrowed 22 million ruble from Russia. At that time, Russia was a major power, had a great influence in Iran, just to go on a royal tour to Europe. And in return, gave the right to the tariff, Iranian government tariff, to Russia as a collateral.
I do know that the Qajar dynasty was borrowing a lot of money, and usually Russian and British banks were reluctant to hand over money. But however, I do know in a particular case that they asked that they hand over all customs duties to Belgium. Is that what you were talking about? Russia.
To Russia.
To Russia.
They borrowed
Okay.
like 22 million for a royal tour of Europe.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, and at that time, the Qajar dynasty was having trouble collecting taxes from the people, right? Because most of they were based on agrarian
Yes, the
culture.
agrarian society.
Yeah. Okay.
So that was one of the main factors. I mean, the corruption and of the government created, and as I said, the way that they were behaving in terms of their expenditures, the way that they were dealing with the different issues, giving concessions to Britain, to Russia. So many people in society, especially the intellectuals, some religious leaders, some of the aristocrats that they were part of that dynasty, they tried to put some curb on royal authorities, kind of control them. That's was the origin of the constitutional revolution.
Because up until then, Iran did not have like a big bureaucracy, did they? They were just, they ruled through patronage, like the Qajar
Yes.
empires. I found that really interesting, considering that it's such a big land, and yet they had no government bureaucracy to control the people or collect taxes. And I'm surprised they lasted so long like that.
Yes.
Yeah. Europe has been the dominant power in the world for a long time, up until 1945. Why its influence on many countries throughout the world? How was Iran different in the way Europe influenced it?
One major difference is that unlike many other countries like India or African countries, Iran was never colonized. Even though Russia and Britain, they were the two major foreign powers with great influence in Iran, all the way
to
the U.S.
build-
became the major power.
Absolutely. To build on that, both Russia and the British were trying to include Iran in their sphere of influence and open trade relationships and extract natural resources from that territory because it's very rich in natural resources, and it still is to this day. And that makes it a valuable trading partner, even to this day with India, for example. And I have to say, at the turn of the century, around 1900, all the nations that, European nations had industrialized. They were industrializing, they were modernizing, and they were weaponing up too. So we have to talk about militarism, nationalism, and imperialism as part of these factors when they were trying to expand their sphere of influence. And like Farhad said, Iran was never colonized like India was. However, if you look at imperialism, you always have to break it down into formal imperialism and informal imperialism. And so informal imperialism is when a nation will open up trade with other territories and use them economically. Okay, whereas in India it was formal imperialism. They literally colonized the territory and tried to change the culture of the people. In Iran, they held on to their culture in many respects.
That's cool.
I find it interesting that Iran wasn't colonized like any other colony of Britain because, and this might be interesting of why it wasn't colonized because for a long time in the British Empire, they considered India the crown jewel of the empire. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
And I learned that the reason why Iran never got colonized fully was because it served as a buffer between they didn't want the Russians getting too far into their crown jewel. Would you guys agree with that?
I don't know the reason really. Maybe
During the Cold
answer
War,
that question.
during the Cold War, Iran was definitely a buffer against Russia, and that led to conflict. And the Soviet Union and the United States definitely conflicted in the Middle East during the Cold War era. But I have to say, you have to go back even further because Iran had relationships before it became Iran. During the Safavid Empire, they had relationships with Europe because Europeans were so angered by Ottoman expansion that Europeans traveled all the way around Africa and traded with the Safavid Empire. And so you have to keep in mind that the European relationships with the Persian territory before it became Iran existed before the nation as we know it
And
today.
that's when Iran became Shia under Safavid.
Mm-hmm.
Around
1501. Yeah, that was the year. That was the year.
I think that perhaps Britain never colonized them because this was after World War I. They were exhausted as a nation. They had poor experience colonizing in Africa, which was right at the turn of the century. And there was starting to be an anti-colonial push in England by the people. And there was no incentive to pour money into another country. The idea of colonizing is to extract the resources, not to create a cesspool of having to put money in. And for example, when Britain colonized Uganda and Nigeria, it was costing them £1 million a year to maintain this colonization type thing, just to extract rubber and a few other essentials, and maybe they didn't want to
I actually think that is the fall of the British Empire because, you know, after World War II, look at the British Mandate when they had to pull out of Palestine. And even India, you know, I mean, they were in such trouble fighting fascism in World War II that they had to promise India independence to fight for them, you know. And I always considered that really interesting because after World War II, you know, they were broke, they were in debt, and they had to. That was one of the big reasons why they had to let their empire go. I know that they pulled out of Palestine, and it was a big problem with Russia, because at that time Russia's influence over Europe and other places, you know, was gaining, and they turned to the United States to fund, I guess you could say, or to stop, to pretty much contain communism in the region. So I found that really interesting when I was studying.
That's why we meddled in the
That's why
Iranian
I think
political
that's why we're
system.
interventionists.
And we got
Every other
Reza.
country in that region.
We ended up with Reza because we didn't want to stay in.
Oh, you know, another thing I wanted to bring up too, and this has to do with the Constitutional Revolution. It happened in 1905. No, think about it. It happened in 1905. What else happened around that time?
The
There were-
Sino-Russia War.
There was the Sino-Russia War, exactly, and the Japanese obliterated the Russians. You know, do you think that gave? And let's talk about Japan. Japan, just for a second, Japan was considered part of the Orient. You know, obviously, they beat a European power. Do you think that had any like effect on Iranian nationalism? Like, hey, you know what? An Oriental country beat this European power that's been oppressing us for years. We could do the same thing.
It could. But again, I'm not exactly sure
Of
about
course.
that historically.
I've never read any primary sources coming out of Iran citing the Sino-Japanese War. However,
Neither have
I do know it was global news, and the fact that it took the Russians months to sail around half the globe, and the Japanese Navy took them out in one day was humiliating for the Russians, and that could lead to an increase in nationalism. But I'm not going to say that that event increased nationalism in Iran, and nationalism was increasing everywhere. Okay, this was a ideology that was very, it was catching a lot of enthusiasm globally. So the United States, there was a push for nationalism. In Iran, there was a push for nationalism. Just the idea of alliance systems forming, different cultures joining together in opposition to another culture. And so you're seeing that a lot at the turn of the century because it was a kill or be killed situation. It was an industrialized or be conquered situation. It was a occupy or be occupied situation. And I think a lot of territories like Iran were noticing that globally, and they were trying to adapt to the modern era, including the idea of a constitution with certain inalienable rights.
Got it. You know, we talked a little bit about the Constitutional Revolution, and the successor who came out on top was obviously Reza Shah, and he's contributed today with really modernizing Iran. I'm talking about building universities, educating women, you know, infrastructure. But, you know, he was, I believe, assassinated?
He was exiled to a small island off the coast of Africa, I believe, and then he died. No, he was not assassinated.
Right, he died of cancer, correct?
The Shah's father, I don't know what was the cause of his death. His son, Mohammad Reza, died of cancer. But Reza Shah, he was exiled and then he died, I believe, in exile. But he was not assassinated.
He was not assassinated, okay. Now, his son, Mohammad Reza Shah, would you say that Reza Shah or his son, Mohammad Reza Shah, really started to send his Iranian citizens outside of Iran to get educated?
Well, it started with Reza Shah.
It started with Reza Shah.
Yeah.
So Iran was, they were, and until now, they're a really educated country.
It started with Reza Shah, and as you said, he built the first university in Tehran. At that time, people were going to Europe to go to universities, to France, Britain, Germany, and he said, why should we send our children or young people to Europe for education? We should build a university in Iran, even attract students from other parts of the world to come here, which Tehran University was built initially under Reza Shah. And you are right, Iran overall has a very highly educated population compared to other countries. One of the main things that he started was removing Islamic clothing for women that
Yes.
started under Reza Shah, basically giving more rights to women that continued under Mohammad Reza Shah, not separating boys and girls at schools, movie theaters, things that still continues in countries like Saudi Arabia that women cannot, maybe they just got the right to drive in 2018.
Yes, it seems like Iran, as part of of what we consider today as a Middle East country, they are really, in my opinion, at the forefront of women's rights but what I find interesting is Reza Shah. He was probably doing everything opposite of the Qajar dynasty.
Yes.
He did not want no more mistakes that the Qajars were making. But by doing this, by giving women more freedoms, he was actually angering the clergy,
That's correct.
and that's and you see a rift start to develop between the state and the clergy, and which is what inevitably led to the '79 revolution.
Yes. So the origin probably goes back to Reza Shah's policies of modernization, westernization, reducing religious power and religious leaders' power in the country.
And do you think Khomeini, the Ayatollah, he did not like that? That the clergy's
No,
power.
They didn't like that. And they did not like Reza Shah. They refer to him as Reza, and they don't like to call him Reza Shah. Khomeini in his speech tried to belittle Mohammad Reza Shah and Reza Shah
Wow.
because they did not like their policies. Both of them were very secular, trying to modernize Iran and westernize Iran.
So I have a question for you, Farhad, and you, Nick. Is it a matter of tradition versus modernity, or is it a matter over who has the power? A secular authority versus a religious authority?
What do you mean by what?
As far as this transition you guys are talking about, when the religious clerics opposed the modernity, the westernization of Iran, is it about a power struggle, or is it really about a tradition versus a modern world?
It was both. They wanted to have their power because before under Qajar they did have a lot of power. As I don't know much about Christianity, but as power of church declined in Europe, same thing. Church didn't like that.
The power between the popes and the kings, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, secular authority versus religious.
Exactly. But so it was both. They wanted to have more influence, more power, and they didn't like modernization.
But the thing with the Catholic Church in Europe, the Catholic Church was centered in Rome. So a king could be in Germany, or a king could be in France, or Great Britain, if you will, and the religious authority was in Rome. But in Iran, they're both in the same location.
Exactly. And Iran has been the center of Shia religion, especially Qom, the city of Qom, which is the center of Shia clerics.
Well, and I think that's a huge legacy of the world of Islam, because Muhammad was not just a religious leader, he was a political leader as well, and he was also a military leader. And definitely, I mean, the Sunnis, they left the foundation for both a political leader and a religious leader with the concept of the imam. But I think it's also in Shia territories as well. There's no separation between church and state like there is in the West.
And Reza Shah tried to do that, but then the 1979 revolution brought back
The issue.
the issue and established their power, political power.
Now, Now that we set up, there was a big rift between the state and the clergy. That's pretty much what led to the '79 revolution.
I think it was not as simple as just that factor. There were economic and social factors involved too. One big factor might have been the White Revolution that Muhammad Reza Shah started by reducing before that the feudalist system was dominant in Iran. So many large landlords and peasants working on the land. And White Revolution tried to eliminate that, giving land back to the peasants. And many of those large landowners who were close to the clergy, obviously they were not happy with this. And Muhammad Reza Shah thought that White Revolution can increase his support among the population. But it kind of backfired. I mean, that was part of White Revolution. Then they had giving rights to women to vote, having literacy, Peace Corps, Literacy Corps, that they were sending young individuals as instead of going to the army, they were going and serving as like teachers, elementary school teacher in small villages to increase literacy rate. And but that land reform, which was the main part of White Revolution, unfortunately caused probably thousands or millions of people who lost their livelihood in the villages to come to the cities looking for jobs. Mm-hmm. And they all centered in shanty towns around Tehran and other major cities. And they were one of the major sources of support for Khomeini.
Yeah, I think it was, there was very much an elite, and the economy was slowing under Mohammad Reza, and a lot of people started to leave. The elite started to flee, driving the economy down, and you had a huge mass of young people, population-wise, and young people are usually disaffected the worst with poverty and lack of opportunity, and that provided the fuel for the Ayatollah to take power.
And this became like a perfect storm because intellectuals from right and left accepted the leadership of Khomeini, and the goal was removing Mohammad Reza Shah, and Khomeini, of course, he was not revealing his hand. He was keep saying that I'm not going to take over political power. After Shah leaves, there will be referendum, and we're going to have a everybody thought that there will be a secular democratic government. But after he left and Khomeini came back, they tried to strengthen their power. They killed many leftist activists. Even many of people who were working with Khomeini, they were executed. So they kind of consolidated their power.
The results were terrific, terrifically bad because 1/3 of the doctors and medical professionals around left. They suffered greatly by people leaving, and when the elite leave, they take their money also, and it really left
their money and their expertise, the brain.
Absolutely, the engineers left, everybody left.
A lot of business owners left too, and consumers. That's important. So it affected the economy because of that mass migration. When there aren't workers, they're not buying goods, and it's affecting the economy. So
the situation, the first few years after the revolution was very bad, and then the Iran war happened.
Right after.
Which like maybe a year or two, like in 1980, I believe the Iraq war happened, which made the situation a lot worse. A lot of people they were killed in that war, about 1 million people. But now they try to ease the restrictions to some extent. I'm not saying that political restriction, but that ease the social restrictions. So women, they put a scarf, but it's not like they have to cover their hair completely. Music is played, things like that. I mean, before you couldn't go outside with a short sleeve shirt.
No.
Before, at the beginning of the revolution, especially in the small towns.
Well, you couldn't play rock and roll.
You couldn't play rock and roll. Loud music were not allowed.
Women weren't allowed to sing in public. They're still not allowed to
sing in public. They're still allowed to sing in public, unfortunately.
That's true.
Young men couldn't have long hair. I mean, the morality police They were saying on the street, cut her.
I recently read an article though that they actually allow gender reassignment surgery in Iran, which I was surprised to discover because homosexual acts are sometimes punishable by death, but
I think it is, but that's their policy toward homosexuality is very bad. I mean, just like any other religion, like Christianity, they don't approve it. So they don't believe that a man can be gay. You can either be man or woman. So if you are gay, you have to go through the surgery.
Right.
It's the solution to the problem.
That's interesting.
So they don't allow homosexuality, but they say, okay, they have accepted the fact that some men have those tendencies, but they don't want to allow them to be. Of course, there are many gay men in Iran, but not in public.
So, the Ayatollah is considered the supreme leader of Iran today. Why is that? Is it because it's like just a complete clergy-dominated state now? And
The political system that they have, I don't know much about it, but it's a little bit complicated. There is two it's called Assembly of Experts and Guardian Council, and they basically choose who would be the supreme leader. There have only been two supreme leaders, Khomeini and Khamenei, since the revolution. But then it's a little bit complicated because the person who assigns the members of Assembly Council and Guardian Council is the supreme leader himself. So it's kind of it's difficult to say that. I guess it has to do with political factions. Who becomes the supreme leader? It's not really.
The supreme leader nominates or picks 6 of the council of guardians. Half of them is picked by the supreme leader. He also has all the power to decide war or not. He decides treaties. He funds the government. He sets a lot of the boundaries that the political class follow. But definitely he is the supreme ruler as he stands for the religion. He stands as representative of the government. And he controls basically the government through his 2,000 deputies, which are infiltrated into the deputies that run the congressional side of Iran. So he is the supreme ruler. His word has a lot of sway. Still.
Yes.
Well, I think, and I've read this recently, I think the Islamic world it's often been argued that it needs a central authority, like the Pope in Catholicism, for example, because it speaks for the interests of the larger Islamic world in that region, because Islam is tied to state traditions, state laws. And so I think a centralized leader sometimes curbs forces of zealotry and terroristic activities, and those are sweeping through the Muslim world. There is no denying that. And I think having that centralized leader can sometimes curb that violence or promote it, depending upon who it is.
That's interesting. Yeah. Okay, let's move on. I think it was after the '79 revolution where America started to perceive Iran as a terrorist state. Do you think it's fair that they do that, especially since 15 of the 19 September 11th hijackers were of Saudi Arabian descent?
Well, the problem between U.S. government and Iranian government started after the takeover of U.S. embassy in Tehran and hostage situation, and that's when all the sanctions started and the political condition or relationship between them soured greatly. So the September 11 was relatively a recent event. So Iran, the relationship between Iran and US goes back to that time. Despite the fact that many people argue that Reagan was in contact with the Iranian government, they just released the hostages right after Reagan inauguration speech. They just didn't want Carter to be re-elected. And then we had Iran-Contra case that you guys probably remember that they were selling arms to Iran and then using the money in Nicaragua. So appearance-wise, they were not getting along, but behind the scene, I believe there was a lot of back channels that they were in touch and contact with each other.
Yeah.
I think the label comes from their support of Hezbollah and other terrorist groups. I don't think the Iran state is terroristic. I think they sponsor terror. Hezbollah angrily looks at our relationship with Israel and strikes out in the only way it can, through violence. It also does, honestly, good in the areas it controls because it creates a social safety net for the people. So you have to say that about them. But when they strike out in the limited military ability they have, it's definitely called terror by us. And it is designed to inflict on a civilian population. So I guess that's a definition of terrorism.
That's why it's so difficult to define it. I mean, Hezbollah, as you said, obviously it's a Shia organization in Lebanon. Shias were very oppressed. They were the poor in Lebanon compared to the Sunnis. They were the majority, but same thing as in Iraq under Saddam. They were the poor majority of the country. And obviously Hezbollah organized them. But terrorism, I mean, attacking civilians, it's on both sides. I mean, not too long ago, Israel snipers were shooting unarmed Palestinians across the border. They killed, I don't know, 700-800 people, injuring thousands. And nobody complained, is this terrorism? So that's a state terrorism, I believe.
To me, that is terrorism. When I see Israeli troops, harassing Palestinian civilians.
Hezbollah came out of Lebanon in '82, and they would have had no power except for the financial backing of Iran. And they did create some very bad acts, the hijacking of the Pan Am flight, the Chile Allura cruise ship where they lived.
Yes.
I mean,
That was
There's no
that was Palestinian.
Palestinian terrorists funded by Iran, according to the information we have. Who knows?
Yeah, I don't know the details of it, but there was a Pan Am flight that crashed that was Libyan. It was like Qaddafi, right? The
In
Pan Am?
'82, Pan Am Flight 846 was hijacked, and then it was flown to Athens. It was hijacked from Athens and it was flown.
Yeah, at that
And then
time
ended up in Libya.
there was a lot of
And-
terrorist acts like that, Palestinian.
They were angry at us for our support of Israel and Israel's routing in Lebanon. But that's, to me, that's definitely terrorism.
That's terrorism. Yes, that's terrorism. Same thing as I said. You see it on both sides. The point that I'm trying to make is, unfortunately, is on both sides. It's not only Hezbollah committing or Palestinian. Of course, PLO did a lot of like Munich Olympic.
Olympics.
That was a terrorist act, and I don't know there are other acts by governments, including especially Israel, against civilians that I consider similar to terrorist acts.
Well, I think one of the major factors is who has the weapons. And Iran has incredible weapons technology, and it's been proven that they've smuggled tons of weapons into Palestine to use against Israel. And I'm sure vice versa. However, there is a lot of proof that Iran has some weapons technology that could be a threat to Israel's relationship with the United States and the West in general, including Great Britain.
Palestinian organization they're not close to Iran. Hamas was a little bit, no, but Hezbollah is close to Iran, and the military industry in Iran is still very small and very young, and ironically, it was developed because of the embargo. When Iran and Iraq war started, Iran could not buy any military equipment from other countries, US or European countries. They were giving all the chemical weapons to Saddam to use against Iran. So that, it's just like when they remove the safety wheels off your bike, you have to learn to ride your bike very fast. So they developed their military industry.
Iran has excellent anti-ship missiles.
Yeah, they have missiles,
which were
ballistic
provided. The
missiles.
USS Cole took one.
Well, when I mentioned
Those
Palestine,
were French made and sold to Iran.
when I mentioned Palestine, I was referring to that 2002 incident where Iran was shipping weapons
I'm
to
sure.
Palestine in order to fight Israel, and that's why George Bush included Iran in his quote axis of evil.
Again, you have to look at both sides of it. I mean, that is wrong. At the same time, who is selling military goods to Israel? U.S.
Right.
Billions and billions. They have the most powerful army in the Middle East.
Yes.
And of course, they are the one that they have been more aggressive in the Middle East than many other countries.
And,
Attacking Lebanon, attacking Gaza, and so it's on both sides.
and we sell them to Saudi Arabia.
And we sell them
Saudi
billions.
Arabia.
and
Absolutely.
complain about the number of hijackers.
There you
which
go.
are-
Hijackers,
Saudi.
and then they are using them on Yemen, and
Yes.
and what are they going to do with all that military equipment that they have bought? Probably start something with Iran, unfortunately. So it goes back to the military industry complex in the U.S., and they have to sell those military goods. And if there was no conflict, they couldn't sell them, so there
So
should
they
be
need to
some
create
conflict. You do create conflict, yes.
Well, today the United States has imposed sanctions once again on Iran, which is surely to hurt their economy and cause hyperinflation. Do you think that Iran might be headed toward another revolution if these sanctions cause civil unrest?
It's possible. The situation is getting really bad from what I hear talking to my friends in Iran. As you know, Iranian currency has depreciated drastically versus dollar, and that causes, as you said, hyperinflation. Prices are going up daily. Many companies are shutting down, so that will going to create more unemployment. There will be demonstrations against the government. There have been, and I'm sure there will be more. Today, as you know, they reimposed the most severe sanctions today. At the same time, I don't see any alternative, unfortunately. What I would like to see in Iran is a secular democratic government. That's the solution for Iran. They should get rid of Islamic government. But I don't see any viable alternative to the existing government. And at the same time, I hate to see change being imposed from outside. I mean, recent example, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq. Look at all these countries that U.S. government tried to create democracy. And I
Well,
don't think
I-
that situation is pleasant.
Oh, it's not pleasant at all, but I think in the United States and people in general in the West and also academics have a tendency to have a very short attention span as far as change is concerned. And you have to understand that change takes hundreds of years, and I think Iran is moving towards more democratic ideals, but it's not happening fast enough for us.
Yes.
But I think they definitely are moving towards that, and I think they will secularize more in the future.
I strongly agree with you. Unfortunately, the move under Rouhani's President Rouhani was more opening up, more liberalization, and the nuclear agreement gave them the more reason to do that. Unfortunately, the policies of Trump administration to clamping down on Iran through very severe sanctions, I think is going to backfire. Nobody likes a bully. Nobody likes to hear that another government says we're going to bring you to your knees. We're going to put our boots on your neck. So no government or no people would like to. I mean, these are the statements that Pompeo made or Trump is making. So I think it will backfire.
The sad part is that if the sanctions had not previously been lifted under the Obama regime, we might have already been to the point. And to reimpose the hardship on the people is sad, and it's going to hurt them. And I don't know, I fear the same thing you do. I don't know how we get to a westernized secular government from where we're at.
As Sabrina said, it takes time.
Right.
I think if they would have allowed Iran to continue more interaction with the West, as Rouhani was trying to do, it would have had a better result, maybe in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, to reduce the power of clergy and make a more open society. Because what I've seen, I mean, I remember Iran a few years after the revolution. Of course, usually those years are very difficult. Till last time that I went there, it's very normal society. It's not like everybody's following you like North Korea to
You're
tell you
being
what's
flogged every corner of the
Fly-
street.
exactly. And I think it would have been, the situation would have been improved if they would have allowed that process to continue. Now, of course, these sanctions, I think, unfortunately, is going to give more power to hardliners. There are hardliners everywhere in the U.S., as you see, John Bolton and other people, the hardliners in Iran, and they say,
Well, you're seeing a
FUS,
polarized,
you're gonna
you're seeing a
build a bomb.
polarization of politics
Yeah.
everywhere in the world right now. But I think if Iran eased censorship a little bit domestically, I think situation would also improve. I mean, it's easy to point fingers and say it's because of you, but I think also domestically they need to ease censorship. And
they need to
and
ease
definitely
censorship. That's correct. Yes.
It's hard for Americans to look at Rouhani and say there's a moderate,
Yeah.
because to us, he's not
Still
a
a
moderate.
clergy, yeah.
He's still-
Well, compared to the
But compared to the
Previous-
past.
previous
yes,
administration,
absolutely.
See, I have a friend who has lemon orchards in Iran, and he has a hard time the last few years. Now he's going to be reimposed with his normal shipments aren't going to be able to be financed. They'll still go to Argentina and other places, but they're not going to be financed.
yes.
Well,
That's
I'm
the
curious,
problem.
how much are these U.S. sanctions going to affect Iran? Because there's not a lot of import-export going
Between our country directly.
between
But-
but I'm talking about most of their relationship is economic relationship. Iran is with
The-
China
the
and
problem-
India.
The problem
Problem
with
is the
U.S.
extension.
is that U.S. it's so powerful and says we're going to impose sanction if you are France, if you are Germany, if you are China, or if you are India, and if you trade with Iran, we're going to punish you too.
Yeah, but like I said, the UN rejected a lot of those sanctions. They're saying they're
The UN
illegal.
can reject them, but they will still be imposed
Unfortunately,
by
like
the
yeah,
US.
many major companies like Renault and other companies that they were going to invest in Iran,
Total SA.
they pulled out.
Mhm.
I mean, that's the power of U.S. economy. That if you're going to trade with Iran, we're going to punish you. It's not that we, the U.S., we are not going to trade with you, but other people can.
I understand that.
Otherwise, it wouldn't have been effective. as
You know,
much.
to your point, I actually read today that India is actually on board, and that's one of Iran's major trade partners, right?
Mhm.
They're on board with the U.S. They don't want any sanctions imposed on them by the U.S., so they're not going to be trading with Iran.
So that's
as much.
bad for
That-
Iran.
That,
Bad
that goes
for-
back to what you were saying.
Yeah.
Now,
So they were hoping that EU will come up with a solution that allows them to trade with the European Union.
yeah,
But I don't know how effective that would be.
Because the basket of currencies that they would have to switch to from dollars isn't as firm on exchange.
And again,
basis,
US
so
is strict
Oh,
that
we are
they want to
definitely-
go after companies that they trade.
Yeah.
you know,
According to the CIA report, China is 27.5% of the exports from Iran. India is 15%. South Korea 11%. So
But I don't think China, they have their own problems.
they have their own
with
problems.
Their own
Absolutely.
With the president and trade, so.
you know, there's a lot of Iranian diaspora living in the United States, in Los Angeles alone.
Mhm.
Do you think if there were a revolution or anything to liberalize Iran more, do you think any of the diaspora living in the United States, and we're talking about educated people,
Very
very educated people, returning to Iran and building their country for the better?
I mean, it's tough to say. Usually it goes to the individual. Many of Iranians who live in the US, they came here 30, 40 years ago. They have established
Mhm.
themselves here. And it's not easy to pack up and leave. I'm sure some will go back depending on the opportunities that the new government will provide. We all had a bad experience with Islamic republics. If it's a more secular democratic government, I'm sure it will attract more people. But I don't see too many people
I don't see a lot
go,
of
go back.
A lot
people-
of Persian Armenians, I think they have made a home here.
Many
and-
Persian Armenians, non-Armenians.
Right.
yeah.
I don't-
I don't see them going back, especially if it stays a
No.
religious institution and state government.
If it becomes a secular democratic government, it will attract more. But again, besides the political factor, I think economic factor is important too.
Mhm.
It's not easy for you. It's not easy to leave California and go to Arizona if you're working here.
Yeah,
You're on going to another country.
Yeah.
the Iranians that came were very, very educated.
And they're hard workers.
They've now had children here that have grown up in America, and some of them have had children, and by then you are assimilated.
I don't expect second and third
there
generation
may be some
Iranians to
older
go back,
people that go
but
back,
maybe
but I
like
think
first
it's-
generation Iranians,
Yeah.
that came here. Maybe they might want to go home because as humans, I believe that we all want to
Go home.
go home. We want to die or at a familiar place.
Yes.
So
It just depends on if you want to go home and die broke or stay in America where you have this wonderful.
that is true.
Even if there, as I said, if there's economic opportunities, if people think that there's economic opportunities for them, if government provides incentive to attract doctors, engineers to go back, I'm sure many will go back because there is still that sense of nationalism. Again, it depends on what type of government, what kind of political system, and economic incentives would be important.
Well, that about wraps it up, guys. I really want to thank you all for doing this. It's been fun. I had fun. I don't know about you guys. I can't wait to do another one of these. But thank you all for doing this
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, that was interesting.
We didn't come prepared. Look at
I know.
Sabrina. Look at
Oh,
all the
Sabrina
We
came
didn't talk
prepared.
about I went through all the questions. You
Highlights.
didn't even get to all the questions.
No, I did all the questions.
Dude.
Hello, my name is Nicholas Olivas. I'm a history student at the University of California, Davis. This is my final project for History of Modern Iran. I did a podcast with 3 intellectuals and myself. Farhan Mansourian, he's a business professor from Iran. Professor Sabrina Jimenez, she's a history professor at Crafton Hills College. And Tim Sumner is a student at Crafton Hills College. These are their narratives on the history of Iran and how those events made Iran what it is today. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy it.